Welcome to the third session in our East European Film Festival. We are happy to welcome Dr. Irina Livzeanu for the third time to our session. She has been kind enough to curate this festival for us. Irina is Associate Professor Emeritus at the University of Pittsburgh. Born in Romania, she immigrated to the United States as a child. She has a PhD in Eastern European history from the University of Michigan. She has taught Russian, Soviet, European, Eastern European, and Jewish history at Colby College, the Ohio State University, and the University of Pittsburgh. She has frequently used film in her teaching, and she developed a course, Eastern European Communism at the Movies, that was cross-listed between film studies and history. Her writing has focused on the cultural, social, and political history of Romania during the 20th century. Today, we discuss Andrzej Wajda's Man of Marble. Welcome, Irina, and over to you.
Thank you so much. I am happy to be back with you. This has become part of my Saturdays, and it's lovely to see you all. As I was saying before the technological hubbub, Happy New Year, and Happy Easter, and Happy Passover, and Happy Ramadan. We have all of these holidays come together, and it's amazing. So today, if you all had a chance to see this rather long movie, Man of Marble by Andrzej Wajda, we can discuss one of my very favorite films. These four films that I propose to you are all favorites of mine, but this one is perhaps one of the first ones I took to my heart because it was so politically significant when it appeared in 1976. I think that's when it was released, but then we only saw it in 77 in the United States. And Wajda is really one of the greats of Polish cinema. And he's a generation older than Kieślowski, whom we talked about at length last week. He was born in 1926. And he died at 90 in 2016. And, you know, he mentored Kieślowski, among others, and Agnieszka Holland, if you may have heard of her, and many others. And he has been very involved in Polish politics during the communist period and the immediate post-communist years. He was involved in Solidarity, Solidarność in Polish, and this was an amazing feat for communist times because it was a free labor union, not the conveyor belt labor union that the communists wanted and had throughout the Soviet bloc. It was a labor union that was very popular in Poland and that had been organized by workers beginning in the north of the country in the city of Gdańsk and other port cities on the Baltic Sea. And then it spread throughout the country and so on. So what you see towards the end of the film, Man of Marble, is some of that organizing by the son of Birkut, Maciek Tomczyk. So it's a complicated movie, and it has, I don't know, I mean, I should perhaps ask you how you managed through it, because it has a lot of layers of history. And I think one of its purposes was really to present to the Polish public in a very direct way the Stalinist past, and how it had been, how that period actually was lived by Poles, and then how it was constructed for propaganda purposes and presented in cleaned up ways. And in a sense also then how filmmakers were involved and perhaps guilty, responsible for presenting that reality in distorted ways. And so I think there's a self-critique involved there too. And you see Andrzej Wajda's name appear on the credits of one of those films as assistant director, one of those propaganda films. And of course, the main character is a filmmaker, a budding filmmaker named Agnieszka, who is I find a very charismatic character. She's very much a 70s woman. One scholar I read says of her that she's a second wave sister, part of the second wave sisterhood, you know, a feminist. And I know we spoke last time about how disappointing the gender roles were in Kieślowski's Camera Buff. And so here we have the reverse of that, right? We have the main character be this very dynamic go-getter woman. Nothing stands in her way. Although she certainly has plenty of resistance coming against her. And she manages somehow to get through most of it until the end, when we don't really know what's going to happen. So the film has the present tense story, right? The 1970s story, where Agnieszka is making this documentary film, which is her thesis film. And she has to get the permission of this television studio director. He's her boss in a way. And then she has this small staff who works with her, and the old cameraman, and then a younger guy. And then there is the past that she's trying to recreate, but basically she's a investigator, right? She doesn't really know the story of Mateusz Birkut. She finds him, and what he is a he was in the 1950s a hero of Polish labor, a Stahanowite. I don't know if everyone knows what that means. These were first in the Soviet Union, in the 1930s during Stalin's time, men and women who were supposedly super productive, and they were hailed in the media and everywhere as heroes of labor and rewarded for their feats. And so in other socialist countries after World War II, a similar model was followed. And so in Poland, you get bricklayers and miners and other types of workers also performing such improbable feats of laying 30,000 bricks in one shift. Now, was it really possible to lay so many bricks in one shift? Well, not if you're doing it by yourself. So, so in fact, there was a kind of trick to it. You had to set up the bricks in advance, and then there was Birkut, but together with him were 6 other bricklayers helping him. And so even though he would be the one on the big posters all over town, and supposedly the productivity was his alone, in fact, this was only possible if 7 people did it together. And then, of course, once this feat of impossible labor productivity was supposedly accomplished, then you could use that to say to all bricklayers, this is what is possible, and therefore this is what we are expecting from all of you. And so what Agnieszka is trying to figure out is, okay, this is what this guy did, and then what happened to him? Why does he disappear from newspapers, newsreels, etc.? And what actually happened to him? So some scholars have said that this is very similar to an American movie.
Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane.
Thank you. Yes. To Citizen Kane, and that Agnieszka is just like the investigator in Citizen Kane. Thank you. So, I'm sure that Wajda was completely aware of this. He was also a product of the Łódź Film School, where they were able to see all the movies that they wanted, and so on. And by the way, of what I should say also about Wajda is that his first movie that he made, fiction movie, was in 1954 or 55. It was called The Generation, and that was followed by 2 other movies, Canal and Ashes and Diamonds. And Ashes and Diamonds is also one of my all-time favorite films. And these movies are part of what's known as the Polish Film School. And it was a first attempt, and successful attempt, in Poland to break away from socialist realism. Sort of observing some socialist realist rules, but also getting around them. But very much the interest of the Polish school directors was in Polish history and sort of very recent Polish history, which had to do with World War II. And so this is now 20 years later that Wajda does Man of Marble, and he is once again very interested in Polish history, recent history, but no longer World War II, but the Stalinist period. And obviously, he's got the freedom, more or less, to make this movie. But what I learned by watching an interview with him is that the regime feared this movie. And of course, films had to be approved by censorship. And he had written the script much earlier, and they held back his screenplay for 13 years. So it was only in 1976 that he was able to shoot the movie that he had wanted to shoot 13 years earlier, or he had been ready to shoot 13 years earlier. So, you know, the 70s were a relatively more liberal period when you could attempt to make such a film. But it, you know, it was still a tricky time. And so what Wajda does here is to show us that, right? Agnieszka is going ahead and making this movie, and she works her way into the archive and finds a woman who can be her ally to show her censored footage from newsreels and old newsreels that are not available for many people to see. She kind of tricks her way into the basement of a museum where socialist realist statues are held, no longer on display in the main areas of the museum. So people, ordinary people walking to the museum will never see the statue of Birkut in his glory, but she gets to see it by using a hairpin to get into that that basement locker in the museum. So none of this is easy, and so Wajda is showing us that even the 70s are not fully free. And of course, the television studio director is certain that this is not kosher, so to speak, right? That she shouldn't be making this movie, that this is no good. But then, of course, you through the plot of Man of Marble, you see how things were in the early 1950s. And you see that a filmmaker like this young guy, whose name, all the names start with a B, but his name was, Burski, yes. So the young filmmaker Bursky, whom you see as a young filmmaker, and then you see him as sort of a 50-ish successful filmmaker, he had started out wanting to make a kind of truthful documentary about the building of Nova Huta. Now, Nova Huta, I don't know if you all know about that, but it's a city that was built just next to Krakow, Krakow being the medieval capital of Poland, and a gorgeous medieval city, very beautifully preserved. But Nova Huta was built to kind of upstage Krakow and to be an industrial city, right, full of working class, and to be an industrial center. But it was not a pretty sight as a city being developed, because conditions were very primitive. There wasn't enough food to go around. The workforce was mainly peasants, young peasants, who didn't have much experience in the building trade. And so there was a film that Bursky made in which he captured those elements, and he even you even seen that in that film, which was called something city, building, the building of the city. You see a bulldozer tearing down a blossoming tree, right? And that's kind of a significant image, I think, of what happens in the process of building Nova Huta, is that there's a destructive element there. And then, these thin, young peasant workers not getting enough to eat and being rather angry about that, and throwing their one little fish at the people serving them that fish because it's just not enough food. And you see all that stuff, and then that's a film that was censored, and his career was going to not go very far. And so he decided to do something very different in shooting a film called Builders of Our Happiness. That's a nice socialist realist title for a film that is totally not cinema verite, but kind of set up where all the shots with Birkut are set up, right? And you see Birkut studying in his nice clean dorm, and then going to class, and then finding his love, Hanka Tomczyk, and workers kind of striding energetically towards their work site and all of that. So that's the film that sets him on a successful career, but it's a very untruthful kind of documentary that is made during those Stalinist times. So, and then she gets to interview the filmmaker who tells her about how things came about, and and so one understands the making of films during Stalinist times, and how the film product is intertwined with the politics and with career making. And I think that's very well done. And it is in this Builders of Our Happiness that Wajda's name appears in the credits as assistant director. So there's a kind of little self-irony, I think, there, because Wajda himself has had to find his way through this kind of career maze, perhaps. The earlier film where you see the unflattering pictures of this workforce was called Birth of a City, and that's the film that had to be sacked, and so on. And then you also see that film footage, that I guess newsreel, that she finds, that the archivist shows her, which is the heroes of labor on a building somewhere, probably in Nova Huta, and then Birkut's poster next to other posters, and Birkut's poster is being taken down. So you see that's the moment where he's no longer going to be honored in the way he had been. And she asks the archivist, any idea why? And the archivist tells her, I don't know, saints' lives are not my department, which is a kind of a funny response, but basically it suggests that this propaganda material is a kind of saints' lives, right? That you create a fairy tale about this hero and that hero, and it's not about reality, it's about propaganda. What else shall we talk about here? I guess the color and black and white aspect of the film is interesting. The documentaries are always in black and white, and the cinema verite sequences are always in black and white. What is in color are the recollections of the people that Agnieszka interviews, and Herbert Eagle, who was one of the faculty at the University of Michigan, who I greatly admire. He was a literature professor who studied film as well, and he has an article that is possibly not all that well known, but I like it very much, called Andrzej Wajda, Film Language and the Artist's Truth. He says that the color sequences are in the style associated with Western cinema, dynamic compositions, more camera movement, use of zooms and other lens effects. These color flashback sequences are purely fictional, and they involve a suspension of disbelief. And this is, they represent the author's eye, and they somehow have a bigger truth value than the black and white sequences, which are documentary and or sometimes fake documentary, but these fictional sequences have more truth value in this film than the documentary footage, which is often counterfeited, which is what Wajda is trying to tell us, right? That documentary can be really untrustworthy. One other thing I want to say, which is that I don't know if any of you have had a chance to see the sequel to Man of Marble, which is called Man of Iron. And that came out in 1981. And it's Man of Iron that got the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. And it's arguably, I think, not as good a film as Man of Marble, but it has some of the same characters, and then one and several other that are new characters. Maciek Tomczyk, the son of Birkut, is played by the same actor. And so that creates a kind of continuity of heroes between the two films. And what happens with Agnieszka is that she had been trying to find what happened to Birkut, and she finds out that he had been shot by police forces in 1970 when there was a workers' uprising in Gdańsk. And then Maciek had decided to leave university and go and work in the big plant in the port city of Gdańsk. So she, of course, falls in love with him and gets pregnant and has a child, but she becomes, and she gives up, of course, she has to give up on her film, her Citizen Kane film, because she has been stumped by this awful television director that she was constantly facing in Man of Marble. And so she, in Man of Marble, she is this incredible dynamic force. In Man of Iron, she really becomes the wife of a tremendous activist. And so there has been some feminist critique of this, you know, what's going on here? This is not, and the critique is not just of Wajda, but of solidarity, you know, that solidarity was a huge movement, but it was because of its hugeness, it was also a very complex and complicated movement which had a strong Catholic component. And of course, this was also the time when Pope John Paul II was the Polish Pope, and that gave a lot of energy to solidarity. And so it's messy and complicated, but not a good thing for feminism. And I think that's all. And I've once again spoken too long.
Thank you, Irina. Thank you very much for your introduction. You have opened up several strands of the film. Anyone with a question or a comment? Okay. Let me begin with your, you spoke about Agnieszka as, emblematizing the second wave feminist of the 70s. And that was one of the first things that struck me as I was watching the film as well. And I think, Wajda has also made her, even cinematically, all those low angle shots that make her look, tall and imposing. So that also kind of contributes to the image of Agnieszka as an aggressive go-getter. And, and even her body language, she just goes anywhere, puts her feet up and sits. And, so all of that kind of contributes to this image, as you said, as the second wave, feminist. And you were curious to know about our, how we read these multiple layers in the film. I'm not sure about the others, but for me, I kept wondering, what is this man of marble? Why marble, And then when I read up a little, then I learned that, it was a time when, these statues were being made and, put up in city squares and all of that. So, and similarly, we have Birkut's statue also, which of course we see dumped in the, but it had its glory days when it must have been displayed, and he was, a hero for the labor class. These are some of the things that, one had to kind of read around the film in order to get to its nuances, at least for me personally.
Right. So the title was a bit of a mystery.
I mean, like I was
first.
Yes, at first, yes.
Right. And I was reading that Man of Iron, the sequel, was actually commissioned to him by activists in the solidarity movement. And he had a very short time to make it. And that the person that approached him actually said he wanted it to be named Man of Iron. So some titles are kind of given to you, but not Man of Marble, certainly. Yeah. And I think marble is suggestive of this made up heroism,
A decorous.
Yeah. But I really appreciate your mentioning the low angle shots of Agnieszka, because I think that goes together with this the shot of the corridor, this very long, too long, impossibly long corridor that she's striding with such confidence. And then she looks like she has legs that are like
Never ending,
feet
yeah.
tall. And she's always wearing these jeans that are, you know, the same pair of jeans. And there is a kind of warm humor. You know, she's almost a caricature, but a warmly drawn caricature.
Any other comments? Yes, Jayanto?
Hi. Actually, I just want to kind of reinforce what has already been said. You know, this whole thing about man of marble, you have to take it in juxtaposition with man of iron. I feel that there is a certain amount of literalness to the second title. Man of Iron suggests that a man of hard work, a Stefano White, I mean, a kind of hardworking laborer who supports the, you know, the socialist cause through his absolute hard work, modeled after Andrei Sakhanov. There is a bit of irony to the term man of marble, suggesting so many things that there are frequent references to his having arrived in that sense of the word when he says that he's an ordinary man, you are a statue. You know, I would mean that it's not a good thing to say about another person, but it has been used here in a context as if it is a wonderful thing to be a statue. And then the kind of irony in the fact that after you become a statue, where do you end up? You end up in one of those, you know, storerooms or one of those, you know, places where nobody goes to see you anymore. And also marble, it works at different levels, you know, different layers to it. We know that some of the most beautiful objects, vis-a-vis buildings, vis-a-vis statues, you know, works of art have been composed of marble. But also there is this inherent factor of wearability about marble. You know, you can chip away at it, whereas you cannot chip away at something which is made of iron. And that is precisely what has happened to the memory. It not only has he been discredited, but he has vanished forever. And this is what happens to marble, which has no permanence about it, which is totally impermanent, you know. And also the influence of Orson Welles, you know, and particularly, you know, Citizen Kane is very, very visible in the kind of this whole notion of reality can never be one point of view. It has to be multiple versions of the reality. And then this whole thing would starting as a journalist who looks for this information for this character who's based on William Randolph Hearst, and then they find out little pieces from interviews because the journalist is intrigued by one word which the dead Hearst is seen to be murmuring. It's called rosebud. And this whole thing, this whole exercise is to find out what probably it could have meant, you know, that, and then he found that it was, as a child, he was very fond of this little boat or whatever. And that was Rosebud. And here also, she is like this very aggressive proponent of a kind of socialism that she wants to have, a kind of freedom vis-a-vis filmmaking that she wants, that she tries to find out, you know, the origin, what has happened, the fate of this man. So these two, I think, are this whole irony about the title vis-a-vis what follows next, and then this, if the influence of Orson Welles and you know, Citizen Kane. Solidarity has not yet appeared in the films of Andrzej Wajda, but they are referred to. They are suggested. Like even in this film, there is this scene where they're going in the train, you know, and they're all singing a song. They're singing a chorus to themselves. And I think that there is a reference of, they're making fun of the supervisor. He says, who does no work? and it is not I who is saying this, it is Lex who is saying this. That means very soon this will become the dominant discourse of the time. So there is a suggestion, the hint of what will follow. That's all.
Absolutely.
I may think of something else later.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the mid 70s, there was already enough freedom and enough organizing going on that the seeds of solidarity were there totally. And I think you mentioned something that I find fascinating as well, which is that Agnieszka is looking at this Stalinist time with some admiration, actually. I mean, she certainly admires Birkut, but she's thinking, you know, there was a real enthusiasm, there was a real heroism at that time. And there were people working really hard and building new cities and all of that. And let's not forget, you know, as we talked about last week, that this is part of the cinema of distrust or the cinema of moral concern, right? So it's these filmmakers are kind of trying to figure out, where did things go wrong, right? Where did socialism get off the rails? And she seems to be one of the people looking at the corruption of socialism. And you know, in her interviews with Hanka Tomczyk, the partner wife, not quite wife of Birkut, you know, you see the underground economy of the Polish state, which is pretty unsightly. And so there is a kind of, you know, they're looking at the 50s. Certainly, there's a lot of a critical eye on the 50s and on the propaganda machine of the 50s. But there is also a critical eye on the present and the corruption of the present. And there are certainly the seeds of solidarity there.
Can I come in with another?
Yes, Jayanto, please come.
Also, I mean, just a reference to, you made a point about how Agnieszka has been presented in a particular manner, very consciously, you know. It's already been mentioned that she's a kind of a representative, also an epitome of the second wave of feminism, wherein her confidence, it borders on arrogance. She is almost, you know, too much in the face. And that is his tribute to this whole attack against patriarchy, which I think Vajda also supports, you know. And in order to support this, his view of Agnieszka cinematically, he uses this continuous use of low angle shots to show Agnieszka, wherein, as you referred to her never-ending legs, you know, it's almost like a child's eye view, you know, when a child looks at an adult with a sense of awe, with a sense of wanting to be something like that. That is, again, you know, not very original, unfortunately, because even this has been taken from Citizen Kane, you know, wherein there are a very large number of low angle shots, you know, and some of these shots were so low angle that I've read somewhere that holes had to be cut in floors so that the camera and the cameraman could go down that hole and then shoot the low angle shot, wherein the whole thing would acquire a dimension with dimension which would make the person a superhero, and this is what is being sort of attempted here also. I found that very interesting.
Yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Interesting. But did you notice also Agnieszka telling her crew that you should use more handheld shots? She's telling them to be more American in their techniques, especially the old man, right? And I thought that was, I don't know if they do it or not, but her saying it out loud was kind of precious.
Again,
that
coming
she wants
back,
them to be more Western.
yeah, and also this whole thing about a handheld camera was, in the eyes of the contemporary filmmaker and filmmakers even now, anybody who wants to show reality within quotes will use the handheld camera, because anything which is on a tripod, stroke, stand, or in a much more supported manner is artificial. It is built up. Whereas a handheld camera, when the image is shaking, it comes that much closer to reality. It's a perception. So anybody who wants to make quote unquote realist films, which have to be believed, which have a kind of a credence about them, which the other kind of cinema does not have, will talk about that. So not only is Agnieszka in this film, it is a proponent of that theory. In a way, it is also, Andrzej Wajda, who is saying that this is real cinema, not your, what will in a few years later be called a blockbuster. So this is a kind of a, strike for real cinema, as opposed to something which has been constructed.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you see it in those two documentaries made by Bursky, right? The one that doesn't make it, which is with the fish being thrown, and the one that does make it, the Builders of Our Happiness. That one is, there's no handheld camera there, but in the first one there is. So yes.
Yeah. Any more questions, comments? Faniraj, Tarkeshwar, Sanjay, Nikhila, Sridhar, anyone? Yeah, Nikhila, please go ahead.
Yeah, actually, it was a very difficult film for me to watch, partly because so much contextual information had to be read up later. So while watching, the process of watching itself, half the time, I was like, okay, so what's happening? So and then retrospectively, you kind of try and make
maybe
sense.
we should have the discussion first and then watch the movie.
Yeah. So part of the problem was that there's so much of contextual information that the film takes for granted that you should know, already.
Yeah.
Which at least I did not have access to. So I was like finding it a little difficult. And as you said, the 2 hours is quite forbidding, time for us to watch the film. But there were two.
It is long. It is long.
Yeah, but there were 2, 3 very interesting things for me. One was like the first film. I do not care if we go down in history as barbarians. Like over there, it is a reconstruction through a staged event. So here,
Yes.
through the film, there is an attempt to go back to the past. And as you said, she is a sympathetic investigator or researcher into the past. So I found both of them. I mean, the protagonist of the first film we watched and this one, I thought that it will make for a very interesting study. So, in fact, I was
Good
yeah,
comparison.
yeah. So both of them extremely self-possessed, and the sense of wanting to kind of I mean the kind of obstacles they face, and the way in which they equip themselves to get at the truth, or what they think is the truth. I thought both those attempts were very, very interesting. So I saw both these. I don't know if others who have worked on Polish cinema have done this kind of a comparative work or seen similarities, but I thought these two seem like very, very similar in their go-getting nature, and their ability to overcome the odds that are there. That I found very interesting. The second aspect was, which I found really mind-boggling, was the layering of the narrative. I mean, the story, the film within film, and so what is, how does one make sense of the layers that are coming through? So I found that quite an interesting technique, and part of the difficulty of watching the film as well. So camera buff seems like a cakewalk compared to a film like this, which I found difficult also for this reason, because there were so many additional things that were coming to form the narrative layers. So the technique I thought was extremely complex over here as compared to camera buff. So these are my two observations. Thank you very much. And also, it reminded me of when I saw the statue, it reminded me of Ozymandias and all that. But of course, this is Birkut, and this is a working class man who had been set up as a hero. And also, another thing that I found very mysterious was, what happens to Vitek, and what happens to Birkut, and why. So there's so little that we know, and even by the end of the film, not everything is explicit. So not everything is made clear. I thought maybe if one had the contextual information, one might make better sense of it. But again, I was thinking, so what is it that turns Vitek on later on onto the side of power, that he moves around in the helicopter? There's no explanation forthcoming. So I was wondering about some of these aspects. But thank you very much for this very complex film. And really, it's wonderful to have you, and wonderful to watch these films.
So you're making me aware, Nihila, that perhaps this is not a good film to just spring on people, without a good introduction, because there is so much historical context that you need to have to make your way through this long film. But it's true that there is the layering of the narrative is very complex, very, very complex. And basically, Wajda wants to take us back to the Stalinist period, but he moves back and forth between the 70s and the 50s. And you may not know where you are unless you already know that history. So for the, you know, I think he made this film primarily for his Polish audience, and they knew it. And it was, I think what was most amazing for the Polish viewers is to have somebody just laid out there, although not, you know, not in a linear way, but in a way that they could understand because they had lived through it and they knew how much of it was suppressed, and you know how many people had been put in prison for being on the wrong side of politics and so on, and then had reemerged out of prison and had found their way into the second economy, or you know a ordinary job on a construction site or something like that. So I think for the Poles this was not a problem, but for us, unless you happen to be a historian of Eastern Europe, it can be. So but you know the basic plot, I mean, if I can just very briefly summarize it, if in case you have the time and you'd like to see it again, maybe when you have, you know, some block of time, is that Poland was unusual during the communist period in that they the Polish working class was much more rebellious than others, and there was a strong Catholicism, and eventually there was this Polish Pope. And so when John Paul II came back to Poland, you know, he had these massive outdoor masses, and you know that gave a lot of inspiration to this solidarity movement or budding solidarity movement and so on. And then the workers on the one hand, and then students and intellectuals on the other hand, were also quite active. And so there was a kind of rather important dissident movement all around. But at the same time, there were these Stalinist trials, and you see Witek being accused of being the one to pass Birkut the hot brick, because, you know, in a way, this is what Stalinist regimes do when things go wrong because of the very regime policy, right, of speed up and engineering this production feat, which nobody can do. And workers get angry because they know they cannot do it, and they try to sabotage that. Then they say, oh, okay, we found the guilty party. And so he was the scapegoat, right? And Birkut in this film is a truly honest guy, and Witek is his friend. And so he joins him in saying this is not right? So he actually throws a brick through the police door or window, whatever it is, and then he gets arrested too. And then you see depicted a Stalinist trial where people make false confessions, and so that is all kind of, I don't know if that was clear to somebody who is not an East Europeanist, let's say, but that is all depicted, and then at some point you kind of lose the thread. You don't know what happens to Birkut, and that keeps being Agnieszka's goal, to find out. And that's when she goes to Gdańsk and finds the son. And then, when they both come back to the studio, he's there. I mean, she brings him there to say, here, I've got, I don't know exactly what that's supposed to mean, but it's a kind of victorious something, right? I may not have the full story of Birkut, but I have his son with me. And then there's another walk through that long corridor. And so it's maybe a little bit of a symbolic victory at the end there. Is that enough context to get you through a little bit?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you very much.
And then, of course, I mean, from 76 to 1980 is amazing organizing, which results in solidarity, the Solidarity Union being formed, and Solidarity actually forces the communist government to sit down with them and negotiate. And that's depicted in Man of Iron, the actual negotiations. And unfortunately, a few months later, they declare martial law, and try to suppress suppress solidarity. But it goes underground, and they can't totally get rid of it. It's so, I mean, it's not that the communists are not happy about it, the communist regime, but there is a lot of power in civil society in Poland. Now Witek does come out of prison, and people did throughout the communist bloc. They were imprisoned during the Stalinist years, and then they emerged from prison. And as the regimes moved on into a slightly more liberal era, these people were able to get jobs, and so for you could either get a regular job, which Witek did, or you could go into this underground economy, which is what you see with the other people, like Hanka Tomczyk and her new partner. They are doing something that's rather nasty and illegit, and she's an alcoholic, and yeah, so it's different than the Stalinist period, and there is still corruption for sure, but of a different kind. And on the first point that you made, I think that the two protagonists of Barbarians and Man of Marble are an interesting pair. Yeah, they are both dynamic, courageous, but they are dealing with different worlds, right? Different circumstances, and they have. I guess I really appreciate having male directors like Jude and Wajda have their female protagonists, such female protagonists. There is something very solid about that. Yeah.
Any more questions?
No, only I add to
Yes.
one point, Nikila.
Yes,
All Wajda's films need a contextualization. Even his very popularized Ashes and Diamonds also needs a
Totally, yes. That's also a very historical film.
all Wajda's films needs contextualizations, including his Man of Iron, which seems to be a kind of a documentary like, but it needs a lot of contextualization. And I was very much interested to note that Nikila said she could easily watch Camera Buff, because Camera Buff needs also a lot of contextualization in its own context, because all Kieslowski's movies, in Polish Kieslowski movies, including Decalogue, needs a contextualization to understand the deeper sense of art they wanted to structure. And also,
Right.
his last film, After Image, though seems to be for a Western audience or even the Indian audience who doesn't know the filmography of Wajda, feels like a very kind of a anarchist liberals point of view. But if you look at the contextuals and the filmography of Wajda, it's a very melancholic film. I mean, you can understand the deeper melancholy of After Images, his last film, if you know the context of it and his filmography. That's why I was.
Which
Because
one?
all Wajda's films needs contextualization.
Which was the last one you mentioned?
After Image.
Is that the one where
That
it's
guy who
an
fought in the
artist,
First World War.
an artist, right?
Art teacher, art professor.
Yes.
who will be,
Yes. I
Otherwise,
thought
it seems to
that's
be
a very autobiographical film.
autobiographical film, which if you look just at being a Western audience, it seems to be a very anarchist, liberal outlook. But in a deeper context, it's a melancholic look at the whole of his filmography himself. And whenever I watch Wajda's films, I think it's After Image for us also. I mean, like without contextualization. So with contextualization, the last film also becomes very melancholic and very prosaic, melancholic narrative of his whole filmography.
Yes. You know, Wajda actually studied art for 4 years, I think, in Krakow before he decided to go to film school, kind of on a lark. So he has that artistic training. But then, of course, he became a giant of filmmaking in Poland. So I think After Image is a very deeply autobiographical movie. So I thank you for that comment. And of course, I mean, it's particularly in Eastern Europe where there is such a long history of censorship and repression and kind of intrusive politics. Context is important, but at the same time, I would agree with Nihila that watching Camera Buff feels like an intimate story, so that even if you didn't know that Kieślowski was associated with the cinema of moral concern, you could still watch the movie and say, oh, well, he's really interested in the predicament of the filmmaker, right? In the predicament of the documentarist. And in fact, then you find out that he was a documentarist and that he was worried about hurting his subjects, the subjects of his documentary films. And, and those issues come out in this feature film. But you don't need to, you could watch the film on different levels, whereas with Wajda's Ashes and Diamonds or Man of Marble, Man of Iron, it's much harder to watch them if you don't know the history he's invoking.
Yes, Tarkeshwar, please go ahead.
Okay, let me take a different take on this issue of the need of context to understand a text, here a filmic text. So I think the theme of the movie is we don't know what is happening and why it is happening. So the entire narrative is structured in that way. Even after at the end, we don't know what has happened and why it has happened. The point the film is trying to, or the narrative is trying to make is that this is what is happening. That we don't know what is happening and why it is happening. It happens, but it suggests that yes, the state is involved, but why state is doing certain things and what prompted them, what is the intelligence, and who are these intelligent people? These are the things that the film is raising, I think. So the narrative should be completely intelligible to me in terms of what happens to each of those characters. Is a wrong question to ask to this film, I think. The film is actually making the point, we are the people, it is our government, but we don't know what is happening because the bureaucracy has taken over. And why bureaucracy is acting in a particular way, and why it keeps on changing its stand, why it is afraid of its own members, the laborers who support it. That is the question I think the film is raising. So in that sense, we don't get answers to the question that the film is raising in the context by placing the text in the context. But in fact, the text itself reveals the context, what is happening in that place. And the text reveals it, as Nicholas said, not in a documentary style, but in a layered narrative structure. Even the protagonist doesn't know what is happening, whom she is shooting, and why she is doing it. So she goes on discovering it. There are pieces of newsreel, there are pieces of information she obtains from somebody, and they guide her to somebody else. She moves on there. So she's trying to piece the things together about this particular person who was once seen as a kind of icon of the labor class, but now who has disappeared. So in that sense, it's an investigative story, but it's layered in the sense that even she doesn't know, even she is searching, and even she doesn't find answers to everything at the end, because nobody knows. And everybody who is trying to make sense of what is happening here, happening there, is advised not to look for it. Keep quiet, don't. This is the advice that everybody gets at each and every stage. So everybody is trying to abandon to know. That is the point that the film is trying to make. There's some mystery. It is not transparent. And there's no one who is responsible to answer. So nobody gets an answer. Wherever you go, you don't get an answer. So the responsibility is evaded in this kind of structure is something that the narrative is trying to point out. So one is to understand the text by taking recourse to what we call as context. That is the other non-textual elements you bring in to understand the text. Another is to use the text to understand the context. So you start with the text to understand the context, and then you start with the context to understand the text. I think both are a plausible ways of producing knowledge. But I think a more productive way would be to use the text to understand the context rather than use the context to understand the text. I don't know whether I'm making sense. Thank you.
Can I come back?
Yes, yes, please.
I fully agree with Tarakeshwar that the text itself will give us an idea of the context. Here, if we are talking about the layers of knowledge required to appreciate this one film, I may just simply point out that this festival of ours itself has provided the context. Today is the third film that we are watching, and the fact that if we trace back, we realize that both Radu Jude and Kieślowski, they were tremendously influenced by, Andrzej Wajda, and therefore we realize, and of course, I think I am fortunate in a flippant way that I've been around for more than anybody else. Simply, when many of these things happened, I was there, so it was a part of a living memory, So solidarity happened, and we knew that the kind of conditions East European cinema was being made and all that. But here in itself, the fact that there are echoes of Wajda in both Radu Jude's and Kieślowski's film, that the context, the structure, the history, the background has already been established for most of us who are watching this film now, after having watched these two films, or even if we have to sort of go back rather than go forward, And particularly if we have to go back, not only in terms of time, but in terms of what has happened with our viewing of films of this particular time, So the context is there. And of course, I'm reminded to what extent is a thorough knowledge of the context absolutely essential for the understanding of a text, There are certain poets in English. What comes to mind first is the poetry of T.S. Eliot, wherein there are, in a small poem, which at one level is very simple, it's supposed to have a whole lot of references which are called allusions, So in the rather famous poem of his, The Wasteland, there are supposedly more than 100 allusions. There are reference to 100 different writers and their poetry and their texts and all that, But even without our knowledge, a conscious knowledge about those texts, the given text here, The Wasteland, it makes a kind of sense to us, And that is what is more essential. That is what is more elemental, the kind of sensory, response to what you have read, what you have reading. How much you know about the background, probably it matters, but not that much, It will only enhance the reading, but without that knowledge also, it is possible to appreciate cinema as well as poetry, just as it is in the case of poetry.
That's interesting. It's hard for me to know how much you need the context or not, but I would think that watching the cinema verite sequences in these Nova Huta, the building of Nova Huta film, and then the propaganda films made about that same thing, that you kind of get a sense of what's going on there, for example, right? So that one is the reality of that situation, and then you have the counterfeit reality being built up. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about, Gento?
Yes, that is precisely what I'm talking about.
Okay. But okay, so I'm certainly happy to provide the context, but it is hard for me to know, since I do know the context. So I'm sympathetic to those who need more of it.
Yes, Tarkeshwar, please come in.
I think the difference between the two approaches is that one is an historian's approach. So there is a text. I'm using this to understand this context. So these are the pieces of evidence that is available to me as an historian. So by connecting the dots, I construct the context through the text. So that context is not readily available to me. The other is a generally a traditional literary approach, where we indulge in hermeneutics, in interpretation of the text, by taking into account the context. So I think these are the one is historian's approach. Historian begins with the text to construct the context. So the literary approach is the context is available, the context of the production of the text, and to make sense of the text, you take recourse to the context which is already available to you, which might have been constructed by again a historian. So if I'm looking at a 12th century text, I look at the 12th century polity, 12th century economy to make sense of the text written in 12th century. So that is a literary approach generally, a traditional literary approach. Historian's approach would be look at the 12th century text to understand the economy, polity of the 12th century. So I think that is the difference between the two approaches.
But Tarkeshwar, that doesn't mean where you don't have a what you call as a kind of evidential history, you do that. But during the Soviet era, films made in Poland, you knew what is the history. That means if you look at that history, you can, because those, I believe why I am talking about understanding the context. Yes, film could be seen in its autonomy. I agree with that. But if the whole basic question is directors like Wajda or Kieslowski were doing consciously some reaction to a history which is taking place there. So I'm not talking about 12th century or 300 AD or 400 BC where we need a text, okay, to form the context. It is not like that. It's a contemporary history, what Hobsbawm calls it as a short 20th century. That's what my point is. That's all. That's all. Because the both ways we can say in abstract that both are acceptable, but this is a very modern history of short 20th century, post 1918, where the evidences are available, the texts are available, the versions are available. That's the whole point. I mean, we can differ in that, but I don't want to get polemical there. But to understand Kieslowski's Polish movies and Wajda's Polish movies, you can see it autonomously and admire it, no issues. But contextualizing, after reading the text, if you want to read the context and revisit it, we can do that. There's no issue. But since Nicola raised the point that it is a very complex film, we cannot understand without understanding the context, all the Wajda's films do like that, including Ashes and that was my point.
Yeah, generally I agree with that you need some prior knowledge. Without a prior knowledge, you can't make sense of anything, including the text. So you can't be a blank slate and then watch something. So you have some prior knowledge, and what prior knowledge you have will determine how you make sense of the text. That is, yes. But I'm trying to raise a more methodological distinctions. So another thing is what we consider as context, where this knowledge of the context is coming to us. It should also be from some representation through some text. So is there an unmediated context available to us to evaluate or make sense of the text or to make assessment of the text is something that I'm trying to ask. It's more philosophical at level, but at pragmatic level, yes, I do agree with Nikhila and Paniraj about the issues, but I was trying to make some methodological and issues at this point, because I have some knowledge of the context, and the knowledge of the context I'm getting through the film. If there is a dichotomy between the two, or if there is a tension between the two, do I take offense to the way the context is constructed in this narrative? Of course, many people might have found that too in this film. Or the state itself can find fault with the way the context is constructed in this film, because their understanding of the context would be different. So in that sense, I was trying to say, one is we need to understand the context that is constructed through this narrative, and then the other context that is available to us, and then we can compare the two. But there's nothing like unmediated context available to us without any kind of linguistic material or representative material, I think. That's the point I was trying to make. But at pragmatic level, I do agree with Paniraj. We need more information to not to assess the text or to understand the text, but to compare how the text is representing the context. Thank you.
So I perhaps Nihila would like to respond to this, but I would say that you're totally right that the context is not simply given, right? I mean, the history of this period of Polish history, you know, there have been hundreds of books and articles written about it, and there are lots of debates about it, and so you're right that it's not easy to establish that context. And what I was giving you here was you know, a very simple narrative of Polish history between 1945 and 1980, which may be laughable as context for this very complex film. So I would agree with you that yeah, it's to really know the context, you'd have to do a ton of reading and research and so on. But I didn't think you know, I was being just pragmatic, and you're asking very important philosophical questions about text and context.
Any more questions, comments? Yes, Nikhila.
Yeah, I actually I'm not sure what I you know, what I was asking for you know, was like, for instance, if let's say you watch a silent film today, so much of the film's narrative assumes foreknowledge. that you already know. Maybe it is the knowledge of generic conventions. Maybe you already know the story in the Indian context. If it's a film based on Ramayana or Mahabharata, you already know it. So there is some foreknowledge which is assumed to be available to a viewer of that period. When it is presented, when it is, given to us, for instance, as we are doing it now in this East European Film Festival, when we are asked to view the film, what the film took for granted, that the audience of its day will know, is not necessarily available to me. So in that sense, it is about the gaps, which are gaps only for me. Maybe it's not a gap for its own audience, but it is certainly something that I may find difficult to understand. So what is this? Why is it happening? That is one. The second aspect is also about the kind of conventions that I as a viewer mobilize while watching this film. For instance, the acting conventions. I found the central character, many of the cues to which we are attuned to very different, from the ones. So it's hard to know, when we see her, when we see her grimaces, when we see her, the way she. So it's not just about knowledge of the political and the historical context. It is the generic knowledge, the knowledge of the genres that we are bringing as readers. That may seem, there is such a huge gap. So all those things, I think, kind of matter equally, as much as the historical and political context. Of course, it's not about just the fact availability of history. Even if that history is available, I still have to read the film, and there is certainly no one-to-one correspondence between the history as it were, or wherever it is available, and what is happening in the film. It still will need me to make those connections, and I agree with Tarakeshwar. Still, a whole lot of it may be left completely in the dark, because it is about the process. It is about why is it happening. So it's not even that there is a definitive answer to that why, as we go on in the film. So it's really about her own why, which also gets passed on to us. So her own investigation, which is being driven by, okay, so what happened to Birkut? So that's also a question we kind of take on, I think, in the film. So I wasn't looking for any kind of pat answers about ready context within which I could easily place the film. I think Wajda is far more complex than just doing that. That's why I said it's the narrative, the difficulty in even making sense of the film at the level of the narrative. Yeah. So thank you.
When you say Eastern European films now in 2022, Nikhila, I'm sorry, I'm not equal in scholarship with you, but it contains political reactions, because I cannot take Eastern Europe out of context and say this is a geographical study of films, because it is placed in a particular category of short 20th century and has the turmoils of the century, and all these filmmakers are political filmmakers. That's my point. I'm not in argument with autonomy of the text and reader approaching with autonomy of the text. But when we say Eastern European films, Now, even if Romanian film, it's a Bad Luck Banging or Loni Poon, can you look at it as absurd film? It's a different kind. And I saw a film, Georgian film by Cobra J in 2022. What do you see when you look up at the sky? If you look at it as a simple narrative, it means you can have an approach to it. But if you look at the Georgian history and in context which is made, at least generally, then it will have a different layer. That's what I was saying. That's all.
Any more questions, comments? Okay. Thank you very much, Irina, and thank you all of you for logging in and participating in the discussion. Next week we meet again, same time,
Yes.
with reenactment.
Thank you,
Okay.
Irina. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And Geeta, the short film competition poster has been circulated, and just to reiterate that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, please, Nikhila, go ahead. You started.
Yeah.
I'm gonna leave you guys. Thank you.
Yeah,
See you
sure.
next Saturday.
Thank you, Irina.
Have a good day, Irina.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so just to share with you all, I hope you've all seen the poster, the short film competition, the second edition of the short film competition that we have announced with a slightly escalated prize money. I think we have one more sponsor as well now, a fourth sponsor, so there will be a fourth prize as well. So that is happening, and then a lecture series in collaboration with any institution that comes forward. So far, we have had a couple of institutions evincing interest to collaborate with TFO to organize lectures. So we'll be getting in touch with you all, requesting you to make yourselves available at least for 1 hour, a lecture of 1 hour during the month of June with the collaborating institution. We are hoping we get at least 5. Tarakeshwar says there will be more than 10. I am not so optimistic. So even if we get 5 or 6 lectures through the month, that is the second program. So just to let you know that these have been the developments in the past week, and we are sharing it and putting it up in the WhatsApp group and also on the Facebook page. So, and request you all for your support, your encouragement, and your constant moral support. Yeah. So
Nikhila, I am circulating it to few institutes where I know to be making it effective. Yeah. And I just wanted to know, get clarification one thing, that lectures will be online or offline?
Online lectures. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Online lectures.
Okay, offline. Yeah. Computation I have circulated, and I will 2 or 3 institutes I know, I will just contact them and I will let you know. Yeah.
Thank you.
If the institutions are interested in having offline and ready to sponsor it, then we can do it.
That's what I mean. When we propose to them, the first question after post-pandemic is offline or online?
Right.
Offline has become so cozy now.
Yeah. So if the institution, the couple of institutions who have asked us, who have evinced interest, they have said no funds. If it's online, we are ready. So
that's right.
So, but if the institution is ready for offline event, I think we are also ready from our end.
Okay,
so
I'll ask this Manipal Institute of Communication is there. I will ask them whether right, another institute there in Mangalore. whom I know, I'll ask whether they could be able to. I mean, that poster, computation poster, I have asked them to display in their institutes.
Yeah,
To whoever students are necessary, and this I'll pursue.
sure. Thank you, sir.
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Yeah, good night. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you
Thank you.
all. See you next Saturday.